Topic is generally the Muslim worldview. Next week we'll look at Islamic theology proper. I'll try to put it together in a nice systematic package for you so you can see, first of all, the internal rationale of Islamic theology, but also start to think about some of the problems, we might say big problems associated with Islamic theology. Then the third week we will look at the question on how we as Christians and as American Christians should think about Islam. But today I'm going to paint with a very broad brush, looking at the Muslim worldview. First, I need to begin by defining what I mean by Muslim. This is a big debate out in the public realm. What is Islam and what's a Muslim? I'm going to just take the traditional definition of Islam and traditional definition of Muslim in particular that's advanced by any legitimate Islamic organization. A person who is a Muslim who is by definition one who submits to God and submits every aspect of their life to God. Now, by God, I do not mean the Judeo-Christian God. I've done a lot of talks. Some of you have heard me talk before, and I used to use the term Allah. Tired of using the term Allah, so I'm just going to use God just for convenience sake. But please understand, I'm not associating the Christian God with the God of Islam, the false God of Islam. But in thinking about the Muslim worldview, the way the Muslim views the world, the way the Muslim views history, one has to, if they're to understand how Muslims see things, go to the sources. Traditional-minded or conservative or mainstream Muslims do not order their view of the world around facts. We could call them logocentric. Their worldview is determined by a body of texts. In many ways, Christianity is logocentric. When it comes to theology, our worldview is shaped by the biblical text. At the same time, we recognize that the biblical text leaves lots of unanswered questions about history and science and things like that. And so when it comes to those questions, we order our view of the world around scientific or factual research. Sometimes that sort of research contradicts biblical understanding of things, and there's a lot of tension there. But in the Muslim mind, the factual world doesn't so much matter when they're trying to understand and articulate the world. What matters is what the texts say. The first or the most important text for a Muslim is, of course, the Quran. I don't know how many of you have read it. It's an interesting read, to say the least. It is not, when you open up its pages, you don't expect to find a chronological narrative that parallels perhaps the biblical narrative. It's a sort of hodgepodge of statements and anecdotes about what Muhammad said and did on certain occasions. In reading the Quran, it's rather difficult for those who haven't been educated on how a Muslim reads the Quran. If you open up the Quran, there are two major distinctions that are made in the Quran between verses or chapters that come from the early period of Muhammad's life and chapters that come from the later period. And so when you open up the Quran, you can easily find contradictions in its texts. For example, regarding the consumption of wine. In some passages in the Quran, one in particular, it says it's okay to drink wine. Maybe my favorite passage in the Quran, if there is one. But in other places you can find there's an absolute blanket prohibition on the consumption of wine. And the way Muslim exegetes, that is, scholars who interpret the Quranic text, resolve that contradiction, is they've developed what they call the doctrine of abrogation, which itself is taught in the Quran, chapter 2 primarily, that says that which was allegedly revealed through Muhammad later in his life, if it's found in contradiction to earlier passages, the later passage rules out the earlier stuff. So if you go into the Quran, chapter 29:46, you'll find this interesting passage where Muhammad tells his few Muslim followers that he's gathered together when he's living in Mecca. He tells them, when you come across Jews and Christians or people of the book, don't debate with them. Rather, deal with them kindly and tell them that their God and our God is one. Interesting, kind of postmodern maybe. But then if you read another passage in the Quran, for example, chapter 9, verse 29, it says, kill the people of the book, or kill Christians and Jews, unless, of course, they're willing to submit to Islam. How are these contradictions resolved? Well, chapter 29, verse 46, the earlier one I quoted to you, actually, even though it's closer to the end of the Quran, is believed by Muslims the world over to be an earlier revelation. So it's ruled out by chapter 9, verse 29. But the Quran itself, for a Muslim, most Muslims, 90% of the Muslim world, the Sunnis, believe is not just an inspired text that men wrote under inspiration from God. The Quran is God's eternal speech. So if you have a copy of the Quran that has an Arabic script, that script itself, if it's read or pronounced or recited properly, it's as if God is speaking from all eternity. So there are many scholars out there, Muslim and others, who say that if we take the Quran in its context, for example, the injunction to kill Christians and Jews, we can just understand that as an injunction for the 620s and 630s during Muhammad's life. Well, because the Quran is God's eternal speech, it's applicable today too. That's the way Muslims, or Sunni Muslims, have always understood those sorts of passages in the Quran itself. Now, when was the Quran put together? It used to be, up until about 30 years ago, for about 100 years, European scholars especially were trying to amass evidence. And it seemed that they were quite successful in amassing evidence to suggest that the Quran developed over the course of a couple centuries. From the time that Muhammad died in 632 AD, probably up to the 8th century. There are a whole host of Quranic manuscripts in libraries scattered across the Middle East and also Europe that show a text, despite what Muslims claim, that does seem to have developed. However, back in the 1970s, late 1970s, 1979 and 1980, a German scholar was invited down to the Yemen and was handed over a whole bunch of manuscripts that were bound together. And over the course of the years, as he carefully peeled them apart, what he found were Quranic manuscripts that date to the 7th century. Probably late 7th century, but these texts indicate to us that the Quran was put together in the 7th century like Muslim tradition tells us. The interesting thing about these manuscripts, though, is when you look at them, you can tell from these manuscripts that the Quranic text has in fact evolved. When it was first written, it said one thing. And then, because parchment is hard to come by in the 7th century, rather than getting new parchment and burning the old, they erased the earlier text and wrote over it. The difference in the text, it's hard to say just how different the original text and the text that eventually became canonized is, but scholars are working on that right now. Just about 2 or 3 years ago, German scholars in particular were supposed to have published a critical edition of the Quran that would draw attention to the fact that the text itself, even though Muslims claim it has been perfectly preserved since the 7th century to today, all the facts show or evidence that the text itself is corrupt in some way. That was supposed to come out, I believe, in 2008 because of political pressure, and you can probably assume what kind of political pressure. The publication date has been pushed off into the future, indefinitely into the future. Last date I heard was 2025. They're probably waiting to see what happens in the Muslim world. Alongside the Quran, which is the most important text for a Muslim, and you all know what happens when you mess with this text. For example, Terry Jones down in Florida, I believe it was just a couple weeks ago now, had a hearing for the Quran and found it guilty of inciting murder and violence and everything else. To prove that it doesn't incite murder and violence, the Muslim world erupted in murder and violence. I think it's rather tragic, though. The last number I heard was over 250 people have been killed or significantly injured as a result of the protests, especially out of Afghanistan. Both sides are if we have to place blame, both sides of the blame. Terry Jones should have known this sort of thing would happen. He has every right to do it, absolutely. But that UN workers, I'm not a fan of the UN, but that they were killed as a result of this is rather tragic. But it sort of amplifies the times we're in. And just how careful, as much as I don't want to be careful with Islam, one has to be. The second major body of texts that's only second in authority to the Quran is generally known as the Sunnah, S-U-N-N-A, which you could translate tradition. And it comprises a number of texts. The biographies of Muhammad, the earliest one we have, the actual manuscript we have, dates to about 200 years after Muhammad was dead. So in the middle of the 9th century, it's not very reliable, but still in a Muslim view of things, it's certainly very reliable. In fact, it's the text they will use to help understand the context of the Quran. That's available in English translation, just simply called The Life of Muhammad, and the original author was Ibn Ishaq. Alongside the biographies, probably an even more important tradition are known as the hadith. The hadith are a large collection of texts that purport to contain things Muhammad said and did when he wasn't under direct inspiration from God. But because Muhammad's a prophet of God, and Muhammad is allegedly the most perfect man, those anecdotes you find in there are binding on a Muslim today too, especially when it comes to their ethics, if you could call it that, and the development of law and other things in the Islamic tradition. There are a number of different compilers of the Hadith. The largest collection, the most respected collection, is from a man named al-Bukhari. I think it's about 9 volumes. It takes up about this much space on my shelf. And if you read it, it's fascinating. It tells you the intimate details of how Muhammad responded to certain questions, how he behaved, what his instructions were for the developing Muslim state at the time to go off to war. Every little detail is given concerning Muhammad's life in the Hadith. And it's especially from the Hadith that Muslim jurists or lawyers and judges throughout the course of Islamic history will derive most of what's known as the Sharia, Islamic law. So it's an extremely important text to understand. It's boring as all get up to read, but extremely important for understanding the Islamic worldview, especially if you want to get to understand Islamic ethics. In fact, concerning Islamic ethics, if you were to ask a good Muslim what their source for ethics was, or what who they put on a pedestal in following concerning their ethical disposition, a Muslim will tell you it is Muhammad. Ethics or morality isn't developed on an individualistic basis or on the basis of reason necessarily. It's developed around following the example of Muhammad. If you want to read a less cumbersome biography of Muhammad, but a biography that discloses Muhammad warts and all, there's one out there by a man named Robert Spencer, just simply titled The Truth About Muhammad. The subtitle is The Founder of the World's Most Intolerant Religion. That'll tell you a bit about the content. But this biography is extremely useful because there are a whole host of biographies out there that draw from the Sirah, the original biographies of Muhammad's life, and the Hadith that sugarcoat things. In particular, I think of Karen Armstrong. I don't know if you've known the name, but she's a former nun who has left Christianity but has apparently become an authority on all things religion. And her biography of Muhammad is entitled Muhammad, a Prophet for Our Time, wherein she writes, it follows the traditional chronology of Muhammad's life, but fails throughout the entire book to actually bring in evidence from the earliest sources we have. It's just simply, she understands the basic timeline as Muslims see it, but then colors things such that Muhammad comes off like an enlightened, rational pacifist. In fact, I was in a mosque, not praying obviously, several years ago, back before the elections. And a Muslim scholar from the University of Notre Dame was at the pulpit preaching to the Muslim community there, and he was encouraging Muslims, first of all, of course, to vote for now President Obama, but second of all, encouraging them to spread the good news about Muhammad. And he told the Muslim community that was there, do not give them Ibn Ishaq's biography, the earliest one, because it tells you everything about Muhammad, how he married a 6-year-old, how he had, perhaps he did it himself, or perhaps instructed his generals to cut the heads off of 700 to 900 Jews towards the end of his life, and other things. He says, instead, give them something like Karen Armstrong's biography. That will, and he didn't use the word entice, but that's what he meant, entice them towards taking a closer look at Islam. It's Robert Spencer's biography that I'd strongly recommend if you want to, first of all, understand the life of Muhammad, but also, more importantly, how it affects how serious, traditional-minded Muslims order their ethical, moral life. There are other sources that are part of the Sunnah. Muslim scholars all disagree on which ones are more reliable versus others. Early histories of Islam, early reports of all the Islamic conquests comprise the Sunnah as well. But if you want to sort of get a broad understanding of how Muslims see things, you've got to read the Quran the way Muslims read it, and also the biography and the Hadith. Good luck. It's not the easiest stuff. There are some Muslims today, a few, some will say it's more, that say these sources are certainly important, but we Muslims also raise up reason, independent reason. And when we approach our texts, if what we find that in them isn't reasonable by today's standards, or to just basic common sense, then they'll reinterpret the text or ignore aspects of the text. There's an early precedent for this in Islamic history known as Mu'tazilism. It's Islamic rationalism that actually raises reason, in a sense, over their texts. But Mu'tazilism died in the 9th century. Some are trying to revive it today. But it doesn't reach a very hospitable audience when it's taught in a Muslim context. For example, a man named Abdulaziz Sakadina, who works at or teaches at the University of Virginia in Arlington, wrote a book that almost has a laughable title, entitled The Islamic Roots of Democratic Pluralism. It was published by a reputable publisher, Oxford University Press, I believe. And the text itself, it's a fascinating read, because what he argues is that Islam is, like the rest of the world, is moving into the 21st century, this so-called postmodern era. And using the tools of postmodernism, Sajidina says, we should deconstruct classical Islam because it's a historical construct. And like a good postmodernist, he says, let's deconstruct it and in its place build up a new Islam that's tailored for the 21st century in a globalized world. Sounds interesting, to be sure. Some people have placed a lot of hope in him. In fact, he gets a lot of our tax dollars vis-a-vis the Department of State. He was integral in constructing the Constitution for the new nation of Iraq. Has spoken at the White House, the Pentagon, and things like that. The problem is, though, when he goes to actually he's not allowed in the Muslim world really anymore unless he's under the protection of the United States. When he went back there in the 1990s to promote a more tolerant, friendly, westernized Islam, the result was he received a hukam, which is sort of like a fatwa. You're all familiar with that term probably. A hukam, though, is sort of a general prohibition. He's not allowed to teach Islam to Muslims. But the hukam, also, you can read it online in English translation. It goes on and says, but you're more than welcome to teach the West this. One wonders why. My suspicion, unlike Dr. Van Voris, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but my suspicion is that he's trying to dress down, or what he does is dresses down Islam such that when we look at his exposition of it, it doesn't pose too much of a challenge to us. Because it comes off like a sort of a deistic form of Islam. And if there's a historical religion in America, it's certainly Christianity has been all along and was integral, but deism as well. And that's how he portrays Islam. Now, these texts, and we're kind of coming very close to the end of our time, and I haven't even gotten 1/3 of the way through my outline. These texts, we can pick up here next week, though. These texts give a very interesting picture of how the world came to be and what has happened throughout the course of the history of the world. In many ways, the narrative you see in these texts does not dovetail or impinge on the biblical narrative, but it does in many ways parallel it. Not to suggest that there's a lot of room for bridge building and things like that. I'm actually, over the course of the last couple of years, come to the realization that really bridges can't be built. But there is a parallel narrative. For example, starting from the very beginning, in the Quran and also in Muslim tradition, one could say that they have always held to very strongly to a theistic worldview. A worldview that says the only thing that really necessarily exists is God. Everything else that we see and the things we know that exist but we can't see, that is the unseen creation, jinn, not Bombay Sapphire, but these Jinn, genies, bodiless creatures, and also angels are part of this unseen creation. But all of this is, according to a Muslim worldview, contingent upon God's created activity. And in the Muslim worldview, God did at one point in time, from nothing, create the entire universe and everything within it. Interestingly, though, right at the beginning of creation, and the Quran itself is contradictory on how creation unfolded. In some places it'll say it took 6 days, other places 2 days, and there are Muslim scholars out there who argue or try to bring in Darwinian evolution and reinterpret the Quran. They have the same sorts of debates that Christians have over creation. But at the very beginning of creation, you read in the Quran in a couple places that God decided to create human beings, to create Adam and his consort, Eve. Eve's not named in the Quran, but Muslim tradition says that Adam's wife was Eve. And the telling of the creation of human beings is really interesting, because what you find in the Quran is that Adam and Eve are created and placed in paradise. Only paradise isn't on earth. It's in a second realm, or the second level of heaven. There are 7 layers to heaven in Islam. And Adam and Eve are placed in paradise in heaven. They're told, or like the biblical narrative, that they can do whatever they want, but they're not to eat from a tree in the middle of paradise. They go ahead and do it. God comes down to them and asks them what have they done. And I don't recall that Adam blames Eve and then by extension blames God. But God condemns them or punishes them by causing them to fall from paradise down to earth. The fall in Islam is not a fall into sin. It's a physical, literal fall from paradise down to earth. But once Adam and Eve land on earth or hit earth, according to the Quran, God in His mercy decides to start revealing Himself or bring guidance to human beings, starting with Adam. And this begins the long lineage known as prophethood in Islam. From the time of Adam up until the time of Muhammad in the late 6th, early 7th century, Muslim theologians tell us that God has always revealed Himself to and through prophets, beginning with Adam. In fact, they say there have been over 120, maybe 124,000 prophets over the course of the history between Adam and Muhammad. Every one of these prophets, from Adam to Noah, to Moses, to David, to all the other Old Testament prophets, to John the Baptist, to Jesus, and then through Muhammad, all taught essentially the same thing. That is, there is no God worthy of attaching yourself to or worshiping but Allah. And moreover, that over the course of history, these prophets also taught that not only is there only just one God, who's one in essence and one in person, but there has always been this lineage of prophets, that all people, if you are to be a good Muslim or a good submitter to God, you will obey. And so in the Muslim narrative or Muslim worldview, they will at least pay lip service to Adam, Noah, Jesus, John the Baptist, and they will say, we believe in all these prophets. But in the Muslim view of things, the message of all the earlier prophets, we can't really know what it is because it's all been corrupted. According to the Quran, only 4 prophets before Muhammad actually left behind texts. In fact, one of them was lost. Abraham and his scrolls have been lost. But Moses put together the Torah. That is at least in name authoritative. However, it's been corrupted. David brought the Psalms or put together the Psalms. Jesus brought the gospel. Their message, though, has all been corrupted. The texts themselves have been corrupted, so they're not really reliable. The only prophet in practice and the only book that is reliable is Muhammad and the Quran. And Muhammad's example, his deeds, his speech recorded in the Hadith and the biographies, and the Quran provide the lens through which they view earlier history. We're actually at the end of our time, but we have about 10 minutes for questions. I'm going to stop here. I haven't gotten to where I wanted to go, but if there are questions, we'll pick up here when we meet next week. Otherwise, I'll go on forever and ever. Yes, ma'am.
How was the Bible corrupted according to Islamic faith?
It depends who you ask. That's always the answer. Historically, early in Muslim history, the first 200 years, they didn't really have a well-defined definition of what they call tahrif, corruption. They believed that, by and large, that Jews and Christians just misinterpreted the Torah, the Psalms, and the Gospel. But once Christians and Jews were encountered by the claims of Islam and started asking the question, well, can you show us where we've misinterpreted, then you get this development about the 9th or 10th century that claims the actual text itself has been corrupted. For example, one classic passage is John 14:16. There's this view in Islam that earlier prophets always predicted future prophets. And so Deuteronomy 18, verse 15 and 18, where Moses says, a prophet will come after me from the tribe of Israel who will be greater than me. Jews have misinterpreted that, or Christians have misinterpreted that to suggest Jesus. Muslims say, no, this refers to Muhammad. In John 14:16, in the Greek text, you have Jesus telling his disciples he's going to petition his Father to send another one like him. That is the Paraclete, or the Parakleton in Greek, the Holy Spirit, who will guide the apostles in all truth and cause them to remember everything that he taught them in his earthly ministry. According to Muslim tradition, Parakleton in the original Greek was actually originally Parakleton, just a one consonant difference. And if you translate, they claim, Ahmed Deedat, the most vocal one who did this, argued that Parakleton, translated out of Greek into Arabic, is Ahmed. Quran 61 verse 6 has the Muslim prophet Jesus saying to the nation of Israel, behold, I give you good tidings of a prophet who will come after me, whose name will be Ahmed. Ahmed is just another name for Muhammad. It means the blessed. Muhammad sort of means one who is blessed. So that's how most understand it. The text itself has been corrupted. Now, when you push them on this and say, you claim the earliest manuscripts or the earliest text, the earliest gospel says parakleton. Do you have any evidence for this? They fold. There isn't any, of course, but it's an apologetic or a polemical tradition that evolved over time as they met the claims of Christians or the questions of Christians. So really no foundation for it. Yet. Okay.
Do they use the same standards that they say our scripture is corrupt against their own?
Oh, of course not. Of course not. Of course not. Today, just to kind of push this a little further, today what you'll find amongst Muslim apologists at the University of California campuses associated with Muslim student unions and Muslim student associations is they will use contemporary Bible scholarship, liberal Bible scholarship or higher critical Bible scholarship, and say, see, even these contemporary Christian scholars like Bart Ehrman, who's no Christian, by the way, but even they're saying the same things the Muslim tradition has said for almost 1,400 years now. Yeah.
And are Muslims required to read the New Testament called the Injil?
In theory, they believe in the Injil. They have to say, we believe in the Injil and we believe in the prophet Isa or Jesus. But if you ask them what the Injil is, they'll say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are actually redactions from the original Injil, the Q, if you will. Or some will say the Gospel of Barnabas. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's a 15th century forgery, but probably penned by a Dominican monk who converted to Islam in Istanbul, concocted this gospel. They'll use that and say, this was the original Injil, and if you read it, you can get it in English translation. Jesus comes off like a prophet of Islam, predicting a prophet named Muhammad. The interesting thing is that this Gospel of Barnabas is based off of two manuscripts from I think they date to the 15th or 16th century, in Italian and Spanish. When they were first discovered in the early 20th century, a big preface was published alongside the translation, 100 pages almost, that prove these things are just outright forgeries from the 15th century. Now the Gospel of Barnabas, though, is published by Muslim publishing companies without that preface. So it's just the text. And there are a whole host of Muslims out there who think this is the original Injil. And because their ideology or worldview trumps facts, it's really tough to tell them, we know that this is a forgery. Why would you even agree to it? For them, they're searching for the original Injil, and this fits the bill, because of course it corresponds with the Quran, and so therefore it must be true, even though all the facts say otherwise. So, yes, sir.
I was wondering, from a historical standpoint, non-Muslim, was Muhammad born into some religion, or what was it? Zoroastrian?
It seems very likely, the best that a historian can claim is that Muhammad is born in a polytheistic milieu. He's born in Mecca around 570 AD. Everybody at Mecca was a polytheist. There may have been some nomadic Jews who traveled through there, but the Kaaba, that big black cube-like structure in Mecca today, that was around back then. They claim Abraham, and then Adam before him actually built that. But in Muhammad's day and age, that was there, and it had about 360 idols that all the Arab tribes worshipped. And Muhammad's tribe was responsible for, or they were the custodians of the Kaaba. So it seems very likely, even though Muslim historians will say, no, Muhammad's different. He was by nature a monotheist. He believed that there was only one God and kind of thought his traditional tribal religion was foolish. Probably polytheistic. He encounters the claims of Judaism and Christianity, loosely conceived, when he's probably a teenager, because he would accompany his uncle on trips from Mecca all the way up to Damascus. And it seems quite likely that he encountered the claims of monotheism, that there's only one God. But what he was growing up, it's probably polytheist, or at least it was in that context. So his message that there is no God but one God, that is Allah, is really quite radical in Muhammad's day and age. In fact, it will lead to persecution of the early Muslim community.
You probably will discuss the different forms of the Islam faith, won't you?
Absolutely. Yeah, next week. That's sorry. If we can get through the rest of this week's
Getting a little more personal, there are many universities that have departments of Middle East studies, and you probably communicate or meet periodically with other professors in that in those departments.
I try not to, but yes.
Well, I'm wondering across it. I've heard that there are a lot of them that are perverted towards Islam. What is your finding?
Generally speaking, both the faculties in our major public universities, in our Ivy League universities, aren't comprised entirely of Muslims, but those who are non-Muslims working in those departments are almost to the T. They soft pedal things. They're not, first of all, their funding, lots of these places, their funding comes from Saudi Arabia. So they can't exactly say things that perhaps could cause funding to be withdrawn. By and large, I can only name about 6 men and women out there in the major public universities, research universities, where their approach to scholarship with regard to Islam historically or ideologically is oriented around facts and what they find in evidence. Everything else is sort of this glossed over version of Islam that doesn't correspond to the historical record. So the first 100 years of Islam after Muhammad dies in 632, you get a Muslim state based in the Arabian Peninsula, all of a sudden explodes or expands and becomes an empire that stretches from Spain all the way to the subcontinent of India. How'd that happen? The historical record, all the evidence that we have, and there's not a whole bunch of it, but maybe about 60 inscriptions and small documents that from eyewitnesses that saw this said this was all by brute military force. I mean, most people have known that for some time.
Out of fear.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. But then if you read the literature out there, there's one book that's written on a popular level called Destiny Disrupted. And it's a story of the expansion of Islam and dovetailed into world history. Argues that the cause of the expansion is that it doesn't mention anything about campaigns, military campaigns or anything, but people saw the truth of Islam and willingly embraced it. Baloney. Not true. But that's what you get out there. And it's a problem. It really is. In scholarly communities, there are all these professional organizations. Middle East Studies Association was the one that the elite one for a time, but it is so corrupted by politics, leftist, progressivist interpretations of things, that a new association was just formed 2 years ago now, Association for the Study of Middle East and Africa. Lots of people are members of this, but if you put this on your resume and you want to go to Harvard or something, you won't get a job there. So that's how politicized things have become, and how much especially the Saudi Arabians have a control over what's said in our academy, or our academies. Yes, sir. Yeah. Do you have the microphone? Okay.
Yeah. So just want to make sure I'm clear on this. So within the Quranic text, something written in chapter 9 can be superseded by something written in chapter 25.
29. Yeah.
29.
Mm-hmm.
But it's all eternal.
Yes, for the most part, generally speaking, yes. Yeah.
Right. So that right there is an oxymoron, right? Because if chapters in verse 9 are eternal and chapters in verse 25 are eternal,
good point. Yes.
Then it's okay. Just want to make sure.
The way that's interpreted or the way that's explained is that if you look at Muhammad's life, there are 2 major periods. One in Mecca, where he's a nobody. He's a young upstart, a naive guy preaching monotheism. There is no God but Allah. And Islam, the small Muslim community, is persecuted pretty harshly, apparently, early on. And so, because of that's the case, the claim is that Allah, in His mercy and wisdom, saw that He couldn't reveal the fullness of Islam in that context, because it would have caused way too much of a commotion, and probably Muhammad and the Muslims would have been killed. And so He it's like Mormonism, entices people along until what's called the Medinan period, 622 to 632, where Muhammad becomes effectively the governor and warlord, where he has all control. He doesn't need to appease anybody, doesn't need any allies, and the fullness of Islam is revealed to such an extent that at the tail end of Muhammad's life, the Quran claims, chapter 5, verse 3, after Muhammad summed up his mission, on this day, I have perfected my religion. That's God speaking, allegedly, and it is called Al-Islam. So it's progressively revealed and finalized with Muhammad in 632 AD. But yeah, it is an oxy. I don't know if I've ever thought that thought, but that's interesting. We stopped by talking about Muhammad and how essentially for a Muslim, and in their worldview, as they look back at history, they see this long train of prophets, starting with Adam, who have all essentially taught the same thing when it comes to religion, but it all climaxes and comes to an end with Muhammad. The Quran in chapter 33, verse 40, says that Muhammad is the seal of the prophets. Muhammad is not better than any of the other prophets in terms of the quality of his teachings or the character of his life. Muslims do believe all prophets past, from Adam to Muhammad, are all essentially the same thing. And they're required to, per their beliefs, to believe in all the prophets they say. The interesting thing is, though, when a Muslim refers to the prophet Jesus or the prophet Moses, they're referring to the Islamic, not the historic biblical prophets. It's sort of a rewriting of history, if you will. When Muhammad, over the last 10 years of Muhammad's life, from 622 to 632, Islam, we talked just briefly last week about how Islam morphs a bit. It becomes much less religious and much more political, militaristic, and legalistic. By the end of Muhammad's life in 632 AD, the whole, Muslim theologians argue, the whole body of God's law had been revealed through Muhammad's words, but also in his deeds. And so when Muhammad dies, it's seen as the closing of God's revelation through the prophets. And in subsequent decades and even centuries, as the Islamic empire or the Islamic world begins to consolidate its control, but for our purposes expand tremendously, especially within 100 years, Muslims will work at putting together or codifying Islamic theology and law from what they remember Muhammad saying and doing. One of the interesting things about the Muslim worldview when it comes to the way they view history post-Muhammad is that they view the entire globe as being comprised of the realm of infidelity and the realm of ignorance, jahiliyyah, as Sayyid Qutb used to put it, a famous first half, a little more than first half of the 20th century Muslim ideologue. And after Muhammad dies, the Muslim community doesn't take a new shape, but its belligerence begins to increase, because just before Muhammad died, he left instructions for the Muslim state there in the Arabian Peninsula that they are, just like he was given the mission to, they were to pursue the world, to fight the world, as the text puts it, and the Arabic term is qital, which means slay or kill, until the world confesses there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger. So the message, if some folks will say that the message of Islam is for the Arabian context. The message of Islam in a Muslim mind is universal. Islam, not just its theology, but its law and its political ideology is universal. It's for the entire world. And the instrument, if you will, that's used to promote the pursuit of the rest of the world is this term that's now become a household word, an Arabic term that we now use in English known as jihad. Was first, it's usually referred to as a duty in Islam. This duty is first given to the Muslim community just after Muhammad made his way up to Medina and this new era of Islam emerges. And in chapter 2 of the Quran, Muhammad speaks to the Muslim community that they are to fight the world, or to fight for Allah's cause, even though you may not like it. On this day I have imposed fighting upon you. You are to fight and pursue the world. The term jihad, however, literally means struggle. Most of the time in the Quran, it's connected with physical violence. And over the course of the history of Islam, jihad has always been associated with, not with self-defense, but offense, to advance the agenda and to push the political borders of Islam. Jihad can mean, though, things like a cultural struggle. It doesn't necessarily require force, or a political or a legal struggle. So when you hear the term jihad, it doesn't always just mean physical violence. It could, even though this may seem like it's not as threatening, it's actually even more threatening, the softer side of Islam. Not too long ago, just a few years back, when a group known as the Holy Land Foundation was put on trial for funneling several $1 million to Hamas so they could buy rockets and lob them into Israel, a document was discovered that was penned several decades earlier in America. It was put together by Muslim leaders who now make up the leadership of all these various Muslim organizations you hear about, that talked about the plans for the Muslim Ummah, or the community in America. And it said that, basically said that the goals of Muslims in America should be not to engage in physical, militaristic jihad, because they just don't have the numbers, or the weapons and the finances. But as the document unfolds, it talks about how there's another way of going about the transformation of America. And that is through this cultural jihad. Change the American culture such that they do not see Islam as any threat, so that public opinion on Islam is not belligerent, but rather sees Islam as just another part of the American landscape. In other words, to bring down defenses against the rise of legal and political Islam. And the term, though, used in that document is cultural jihad. Now, I'm not suggesting that America is going to be Islamized in 10 years, or maybe even 20 years. Who really knows? Like, I'm fond of saying, like Muhammad, I'm no prophet. In the Muslim community, especially in Muslim organizations, those that are political and legal in nature especially, that is their goal. Whether they achieve it or not is, who knows? It's largely up to us, actually, if they achieve it or not. But that is their stated goal, not some right-wing conspiracy theorist like myself up here telling you that's their goal. That's in the documents themselves. Going back, though, a bit in history, just after Muhammad dies, as Muslims start thinking about Islamic statecraft, they start to develop an interesting, to say the least, view of the world that sees the world as comprising essentially two domains, or two spheres of influence. One sphere is the domain of Islam. I've got the Arabic in your outline. It's Darul Islam. And that region is defined classically as lands that are comprised of a majority Muslim population. Christians and Jews can exist in these populations as second-class citizens, but the majority is Islamic, the governance is Islamic, the legal system is Islamic, the economic system, the ethical system, and everything else is Islamic. And the way the earliest booklet or manual on foreign policy in Islam, which was put together around the end of the 8th century, simply called the Siyar, International Law in Islam, says that that domain or that sphere outside of the domain of Islam is construed as the domain of war, Darul Harb, or some documents put it this way, Darul Jihad, the domain of the struggle, into which the domain of Islam is commanded by God via Muhammad to expand. That's just in the historical literature. And throughout the course of the centuries, as Islam expanded and sometimes contracted, you see these terms being used over and over again. But over time, you also see some new terms introduced. And contemporary Muslims will use these as a way to try to dress down the belligerents of Islam. And they say, and they're right, it's true, that there have been some classic Muslim thinkers who say the world is not just comprised of two domains, but there's a third domain, the domain of peace, or the domain of the treaty, in between the domain of Islam and the domain of war. As if to suggest that this is a perpetual domain where Muslims and everybody else can live in perpetual peace. Interestingly, though, if you look at these documents closely where the term domain of peace as a third domain is brought up, they always, the thinkers who are concocting this political theory see the domain of peace as simply a temporary domain. The theory is that if an Islamic state doesn't have enough power, military, political, or otherwise, to be successful in expanding its reach, they can negotiate a peace treaty with those regions or those powers in the domain of war. However, that treaty can only last 10 years at the most. And if in the sources themselves, if the Muslim state amasses enough wealth and military power before that treaty expires, it's incumbent upon that state to begin hostility again. That's just in the literature. If you want to see how jihad and the struggle to, as the Quran puts it, advance the cause of Islam, such that by the end of history, as Quran 9:33 puts it, Islam triumphs over all other systems of belief. The best book is in your bibliography under Islamic Theology, Law, and Politics, written by David Cook. The title is simply Understanding Jihad. Published, oddly enough, by University of California Press, based out of Berkeley University, and I have no idea where he's allied, but he's just a good, genuine scholar. He compiled every text ever written in the classic Islamic languages, so Arabic, Persian, and Urdu, from the 7th century up until present, and read through them all, and tried to distill what jihad has always meant for Muslim authors, writing to their own people, not to Western people that they're trying to confuse. And he says 99% of the times, jihad is construed in Islamic literature as offensive, not even self-defensive, but actually offensive, to advance the cause of Islam. There was one exception he found, written in Persian, written by a man many of you are familiar with. He died about 20 years ago now, Ayatollah Khomeini, who wrote a book entitled The Greater Jihad, where he argued that the best jihad, the ideal struggle for the individual Muslim, is to struggle with their passions and their constant temptation to sin. But if you read this document closely, David Cook arguments, while there are some out there who argue this is what jihad should mean today, he says if you read it closely, you see that Ayatollah Khomeini said the only way this sort of jihad could take place, though, is if the whole world is Islamized. Because the lesser jihad, the physical, political, legal jihad will be over, and then finally the whole world can work at struggling with its passions and correcting its moral life. The bifurcation of the world into the two domains, domain of Islam and domain of war, you will find that there are Muslims out there who say, we've never believed that, or I don't believe it at least. However, one Muslim scholar, a man named Tariq Ramadan, sometimes known as the Martin Luther of Islam, for a long time was forbidden from entering the U.S. up until about 2 years ago when the Secretary of State simply wrote a letter to the Immigration Board telling them, you will let this man in the country. He was forbidden from entering the U.S. because several $1,000s of his own personal wealth went to Hamas. Now he's allowed in the country, comes here and lectures. He wrote a book called Western Muslims and the Future of Islam, and he actually admits, and this is 2005, that Muslims have historically, even to present, seen the world through this bifurcated lens, domain of Islam and domain of war. Interestingly, though, and I know I've said interestingly about 4 times now, I'll try to stop. Tariq Ramadan says, we shouldn't see the world this way anymore. Because if you look around, he says, there is no domain of Islam anymore. There's no region in the world where there's a majority Muslim population and you have a bona fide, legitimate Islamic government. At one time there was. The Taliban had one. But even in places like Egypt, even Saudi Arabia, those regimes that look Islamic aren't purely Islamic. There's no permission given in the Quran or the traditions for a king or for international trade. And so Ramadan and others argue that the whole Muslim world itself has collapsed. But whose fault is it? It's the West's fault. The Islamic world has bought into, or has been perhaps even, or has been enticed, or perhaps even been forced to adopt Western forms of governance, aspects of Western law and economics, and so on and so forth. So Ramadan's remedy is that Muslims living in the Western world today not see the world as comprising the domain of Islam or the domain of war, but rather see the whole world as the domain of testimony, where Muslims, wherever they find themselves, testify to and struggle in their particular context to bring whatever geopolitical space they live in into the norms of Islam. In other words, to work at trying to establish a domain of Islam again. To serve as a base. The Arabic term for base is qaida, al-Qaeda, the base, from which operations could ensue to bring other parts of the world into this domain of Islam. And when Ramadan writes this, he writes in very eloquent English. He's been trained at the best universities in Europe. He writes it in such a way that you don't really see what he's going after. But if you're familiar with classic Islamic thought, it's very clear that Tariq Ramadan and his friends, like my doctoral advisor, are very much interested in Islamizing whatever piece of land they live in. Let me just stop here. We have 5 minutes till the end, and we haven't gotten to what we were supposed to do today. If there are any questions, let me ask if there are any questions.
Yes, by what means you say they want to bring this about? By what means?
This may seem trite or cliche, but any means necessary. So it could be, and the way they'll usually talk about it is, here in America or in the Western world, we don't need to use force of arms. In fact, in Europe, many of them kind of scoff and say, we don't have to use arms. The Europeans are just falling all over themselves, allowing us to do what we want. But they'll often talk about cultural and legal jihad. Others will talk about the term dawah, that is calling people to Islam. Proselytizing, mission activity, evangelism. But even that doesn't sound quite right. But those are the usual means. Sometimes it could be just being friendly and being a nice liberal Muslim, so you don't upset your neighbors or make them suspicious. So any means necessary. And there is a doctrine in Islam, maybe we mentioned last week, but generally defined as dissimulation or deception, taqiyya, if you want to do a Google search on it, that says you can disassociate yourself with, say, the more extreme versions of Islam, that is the classical versions of Islam, paint yourself as a moderate Muslim, go to bars and drink liquor, perhaps the night before you're going to fly a plane into a building, so that you don't draw attention to yourself. That's perfectly legitimate in Islam.
I had talked to you last week, and you said maybe bring it up this time about what's the significance of the 12th? Is it the 12th Imam in Iran?
Yes. Yeah, the 12th Imam. We didn't do it only for sake of time, but after Muhammad dies, the first issue that faces the Muslim state out of Arabia is who should succeed Muhammad, and what's the character of his successor. Is the one who succeeds Muhammad simply one who just carries on the traditions of Muhammad? And that would be the Sunni answer, or the traditionalist answer. The line of prophethood has come to a close, so there's no new revelations. All we can do is just simply copy what Muhammad said and did. The other side, known as Shi'ism or Shiite Islam, answered it differently. They said it should be somebody who knew Muhammad all along, who knows the traditions, but it's somebody who should be connected to him by bloodline. And their solution was Ali, Muhammad's son-in-law and cousin, I believe. Is that right? Cousin or nephew? I always get those. I believe cousin. And he was the closest male relative. And so that community said he's the rightful successor because he has the bloodline, the charisma of the prophet pumping through his veins. And they argued that as Islam begins to expand, the state will encounter new unprecedented circumstances that Muhammad never even anticipated. And so you need somebody who has a bit of charisma to address these new situations. Ali eventually becomes the successor the fourth time, beginning in 656. He's the fourth of the successors. From him, according to Shiites, begins the line of the imamate. I-M-A-M-A-T-E. And some forms of Shi'ism say that there are 7 imams from the time of Ali. The more popular version of Shi'ism, the one that's espoused by the Iranian regime, is 12er Shi'ism that says there has been a line of 12 imams from Ali down to the 9th century. The last of the imams was a 4 or 6-year-old boy, the sources disagree or contradict each other, who immediately following giving the prayers for his father, the 11th imam, disappeared from history. But he's still living, even today. He's what's called the hidden imam. The President Ahmadinejad apparently thinks he lives down in the bottom of this well in Tehran, or maybe it's Qom. But the Iranian people especially believe that this 12th imam is around somewhere, and sort of like some of this, sort of the Christian dispensationalism believes that if events get bad enough, you can predict, and in Shi'ism, you can force the return of this imam. So lob a nuke at Israel, and they know full well what Israel will do. Israel even hears wind of it. They'll lob who knows how many back at Iran, or preempt that strike probably. That will cause the international scene to be so horrendous that the imam will come back. And when he comes back, Jesus is going to return and pursue Jews, kill Jews, crush every crucifix they can find, and kill every pig they can find. And then Jesus will die and rise again. The imam will start or will create this global Islamic empire. So they're looking for his return. I think, yeah, we're way past time, so we've got to stop. But I'll stick around for 2 weeks. It seems like 10 weeks, and I don't know why I've been thinking about it. It's either such a good question, or my answer was so poor that it stuck in my head. And the question was regarding why our civil leaders, our political leaders, insist on speaking of Islam as a religion of peace. And I think I said something to the effect that it's largely a strategic issue in order to keep what Muslims are perhaps friends with America on board with us. It's a way to appease them. There's another way of thinking about it that I think is important for understanding today's situation. If you go back to the 1990s, there were 2 major political scientists who published essays which eventually became books that guided public policy on all sorts of things. The first was Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. This is a fairly popular book. It started off as just a journal article, but caused a huge uproar, a backlash, and he was maligned by many of his academic peers. But as things turned out, Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, which argued that at the root of civilization are religious ideas, or theology, or we might say metaphysical ideas. And those fundamental ideas that shape civilization, when you compare them to other civilizations, do not cohere very well, if at all. And Huntington argued that in the future, he's writing in the 90s, but he says in the 21st century, in order to think about the world, our policymakers should take into account religious beliefs when it comes to dealing with other parts of the world, whether it be China or the Islamic world, which Huntington says, or said, quoting Bernard Lewis, has always had bloody borders. Huntington was more of a realistic approach to international politics. The other man who wrote, who became much more popular and was, at least his ideas were embraced by a large part of our policy-making officials, that was Francis Fukuyama, who wrote a book, an essay first, but then a book called The End of History and the Last Man. And what he argued was, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and then the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, he says, this shows that democratic pluralism is the strongest form of polity. And because it's fallen in the communist world, and communism has fallen in the communist world, and democratic pluralism seems to be taking off, he says we can bet that the rest of the world will start embracing democratic pluralistic forms of polity. And he argued that once this happens, as this happens, and if we can help usher it along, what we'll see is the world will no longer be shaped by conflicts. For him, history is a series of conflicts. Once everybody becomes democratic in some sense, then we'll enter a new era where history will come to an end and everybody will get along just fine. He's not a utopian thinker, but it's pretty close to it. He's since gone back on this argument. But it was that book, or those ideas, that really shaped especially American policymakers in their thinking about the late 20th, early 21st century. And I would argue, or I think it's reasonable to suggest that many of the folks in Washington still look at the world through this lens. That if we can expedite or export democracy, perhaps force it on people, then we'll all get along. As Iraq and other places are showing, that's a kind of a simplistic picture of things. Anyway, that's the political science theory, and I think it helps us explain why or helps us understand why many of our policymakers refuse to call Islam what it is. It is not a religion of peace. They can use the term peace, but they mean something entirely different by it. It's a peace in accordance with Islam's requirements, and it's a peace which relegates all non-Muslims to, at best, second-class citizen status. The term is dhimmitude. Now, today we're going to look at the theology of Islam, the particulars or the details of Islamic theology, because this is of primary concern for the Christian. There are all sorts of what Lutherans would call left-handed kingdom concerns or civil concerns we have with Islam, and we certainly cannot lose sight of that. But when it comes to dealing with a particular Muslim that you might know, or just thinking about Islam as a Christian, it's extremely important to understand the contours of Islamic theology. You'll notice perhaps that there are parts of Islamic theology, and we've covered a few of them, where Islam parallels, doesn't impinge on the Islamic or the Christian historical theological narrative, but parallels it a bit, but oftentimes these parallels are at odds with each other. And the interesting thing about Islamic theology, though, is that if you looked at the hundreds, thousands of writings that Muslims have composed, Muslim intellectuals and statesmen and scholars, you would be hard-pressed to find a book entitled something like Muslim Theology. According to Tariq Ramadan, the man I mentioned last week when I asked the videographers to edit that part out, Tariq Ramadan being the so-called Martin Luther of Islam, he argues in his book from 2005 that there is no Islamic theology. And what he meant by that is Muslims don't typically or historically haven't sat down behind a desk, read all sorts of books, and tried to develop systems of theology that they map out in systematic theological texts or that they put down in confessional texts. Tariq Ramadan argues, and many other Muslims, that the best or the only Islamic theology is the Quran. If you're to speak appropriately about Islam and its theology or its view of God and man, what you say as a Muslim, or if you're a non-Muslim describing it, must correspond to the Quranic texts. So one might think understanding Islamic theology is pretty easy. You just comb through the Quran. But the Quran's and Mr. Rowley's read it probably a dozen times, maybe, perhaps. It's a very difficult text to get through. And some of the passages in there are so obscure that it takes some extra reading to understand just how Muslims have taken some of these texts. For example, Quran chapter 7, verse 172 talks about these entities standing before Allah, and Allah says to them, "Will you take me as your Lord?" And they respond by saying, "We will take you as our Lord." And there's no other context to the verse. You don't really know what's going on. As Muslim theologians have explained it, though, that refers to this primordial covenant that all human beings, before they were born at some point, and they don't speculate how it all happened, but at some point before our birth in time and space, our souls stood before Allah. And Allah said, "When you're born into the world, will you take me as your Rabb, your Lord?" And apparently we all said yes. They squeezed that out of the Quran. In light of this, what we might call doctrine, I would say that to understand Islam, one has to understand Islam around the matrix of Islamic anthropology. That is, its view of man. Before we get there, though, we're going to start quickly with its doctrine of God. We all know that Islam is a monotheistic religion. It believes that there is only one God. The first part of the Muslim confession of faith is there is nothing worthy of being worshipped. There is no ilah in the Arabic. There is nothing worthy of attaching yourself to or allying yourself with but Allah. And according to Islamic theology, Allah is one in essence, but also one in person, if he can be described, or it can be described as a person. Allah does not have partners, the Quran says over and over again. That is, Allah does not have a Holy Spirit, does not have a son, because he has no female consort. He is one in essence and one in person. So when you'll get folks out there, Muslim and non-Muslim, who will say Christians and Muslims worship the same God in essence. That's manifestly false. The Christian church has bought into this, though. Not our church, thankfully, and there are lots of churches out there that haven't. But for the last 4 years, there's been this national dialogue going on that has actually become international, called the Common Word Between Us and You. It was the first document penned under this international dialogue was penned in October of 2007, based out of Amman, Jordan. About 138 Muslim scholars, famous Muslim scholars and politicians, got together and put together a document that addresses the Christian church, addresses the Pope, the patriarchs of the Orthodox Church, general secretaries, presidents of other church bodies. I don't think the LCMS got a copy, but most other major church bodies did. And the document is Muslims petitioning Christians to join with them in common cause, under the assumption that we all worship the same God and we all have some similar motifs in our religion. In Islam and Christianity, the document reads, both Christians and Muslims believe that the highest thing you could do is love God. The second most important thing you should do or can do is love your neighbor. And they argue, this document argues, that if Christians would just acknowledge this, then Christians and Muslims, who comprise half the world's population, could work together in establishing global peace. One might or perhaps should expect this sort of thing from the Muslim world. The Quran itself, in chapter 3, encourages Muslims to call Christians and Jews in particular, but especially Christians, to a common word. One should not expect, though, Christians to fall all over themselves trying to get on board with this project. Shortly after the document was sent out in October of 2007, scholars based out of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, Christians of every stripe, started signing a response document that was published in the New York Times and since then has garnered about, I think, 3,000 signatures from Christians from almost every church body, and including some very respectable theologians like John Stott and J.I. Packer and others. They're not in the Lutheran tradition, but there certainly are, at least historically, have been stellar evangelical theologians. But in this document that they all signed, it acknowledges, first of all, yes, we all do worship the same God, and we can all go about engaging in this international dialogue, striving towards world peace. As you read the document, though, as soon as you get to the second paragraph, the Christian respondents say, before we go any further, though, we want to do two things. Actually, one thing that has two components. We want to apologize to the Muslim world. First of all, we want to apologize for the Crusades, because apparently we're all responsible for a 11th, 12th, and 13th century activity of the Catholic Church. And then it goes on and says, we also want to apologize for the excesses, and it puts in quotes, the war on terror, as if to suggest the war on terror isn't in some way legitimate. But then it goes on fawning all over Islam, and then comes to an interesting part in the letter where it says, where it refers to Muhammad not as the prophet of Islam, but the prophet Muhammad, as if to suggest, or at least throw the Muslim world a bone, to suggest that Muhammad might in some sense be a prophet of God. And there has been a long debate amongst primarily missiologists, that is, theologians who are interested in the study of missions, over whether Christians can regard Muhammad as a prophet, because he altered the Arabian Peninsula's theological milieu. It used to be polytheistic. Muhammad comes and they embrace a monotheism. So that debate's been around for actually several decades within Christianity, but now it's become popularized. Following the common word between us and you dialogue that's still going on, they're having conferences all across the world now about it. The Congress signed on to what's called House Concurrent Resolution 374. When they got wind of this document that Christian and Muslim theologians and intellectuals had contrived, congressmen decided that they ought to put something together that says, we agree with this and we'll give whatever sort of support we can. HCR 374 was written by the first Muslim American congressman, Keith Ellison, from southern Minnesota. I think the 14th district, which is comprised of a very heavy Lutheran population, mostly ELCA though. The other Muslim congressman that we have, Andre Carlson, has Lutheran connections too, believe it or not. He has a bachelor's degree from Concordia University of Mequon. Just thought I'd throw that out there. Getting back to the theology though, to understand Islam, first of all you have to understand that it is monotheistic, but it is not a Trinitarian monotheism. If we could maybe describe its monotheism, we might say a transcendental monotheism. For the Muslim, the God or Allah is outside of time and space, has always been there, and rarely, in fact, never penetrates time and space. Sometimes he uses angels like Gabriel to send down his message. He's done that in the past with Muhammad, says Muslim theologians. But he's aloof, largely aloof of creation. Does not intercede through miracles. It's not that he's not concerned with what goes on in the world, not concerned with what people do, but he's aloof. But at the same time, he knows everything. According to the Quran, Allah is as close to Muslims and everybody else as our jugular veins are as close to us. Kind of a imposing picture. But he's not close in the sense that he's sent a son or that he actually reveals himself without using a created medium like the angel Gabriel. The term that you will see Muslims using to describe their doctrine of God is this term on your outline, pronounced tawheed. The way it's oftentimes translated from the Arabic is the unicity of God. God is wholly one, but also He's the only one who really does exist. Everything else, everything within creation, according to Islam, doesn't necessarily exist. It's contingent upon God's created activity. There are some Muslims who will go so far as to say that every moment is contingent upon God's created activity. That is, every second that's passed since we first got together today, about 25 minutes ago, was a process of God's continuous creation, destruction, creation, destruction. Every single moment, God is rearranging atoms and recreating reality for us. And some will go so far as to say that everything that happens is all predetermined by Allah. Every single thing, all your deeds, your thoughts, what's going on across the world, everything is already orchestrated or preordained and created by Allah. Now, getting to the real, I think the heart and soul of Islam, at least for our purposes, for at least understanding Muslim people, we have to look at the Islamic doctrine of creation. I told you in the first 2 weeks when we looked at the Muslim worldview, the general worldview, that they certainly believe that God created ex nihilo, from nothing. In creation, there's a strong sense in Islam. In fact, it's incumbent upon Muslims to acknowledge that God created creation from nothing. But within creation, He didn't just create the physical things, the things we can see, but He also created a bunch of unseen realities, the invisible powers. In Islam, there's a strong belief that the universe is teeming with jinn. My joke is, you've probably heard it before, it's probably on tape from a couple weeks ago, not Bombay Sapphire or anything good like that, but genies. These spirit creatures, they're like human beings, except they don't have bodies. They're not angels. They have free will, but the universe is teeming with these things. And it's the jinn that cause you, and in my case, Bombay jinn, that caused me to do things and think things I wouldn't normally think. I'm kidding. I do like jinn, but not a whole lot of it. I'm getting too old for it. But these jinn are the ones that whisper in your ears, according to Islam, to draw you off the straight path. That is the path of Islam that you know by virtue of your creatureliness. In Islam, as I suggested when we first started talking today, or I started talking, in Islam, every human being, everything, every creature, animal, plant, and even the universe itself is described as Muslim by nature. That is, it submits perforce or by necessity to the law of Allah. And Muslim theologians will say, if you look at the universe, it operates in an orderly manner. It has to obey the physical laws of the universe. If you look at most living creatures that you can see, plants and animals, they operate in an orderly, predictable way based on their instinct, but that instinct is ordered and placed there by God. They all operate in a predictable way because they're all operating in view or under Allah's law. There's one exception in Islam, and that is human beings. Human beings, unlike the rest of creation, have been given free will. Well, the jinn as well. Given free will, however, according to Quran chapter 3 or 30 verse 30 and Quran 7 verse 172, all human beings, even though they have free will in some sense, are by nature, their essential makeup, their genetic makeup, they're Muslim. It's just that they've gone away from their Muslimness. There's this isn't from the Quran, but from a hadith, or tradition, that where Muhammad says every human being was born a Muslim. It's their parents or some other external distraction or other religion, Judaism, Christianity, Zoroastrian, or some other philosophy that has drawn them astray. But every one of us, every human being, if we thought hard enough and stopped attaching ourselves to worldly philosophies or false religions and things of that nature, we would, by nature, do what Muslims do. There's a passage in the Quran, I don't remember chapter and verse, that says, when the sun rises, you see the shadow of plants hit the ground. That's a sign from Allah that that's to be our natural disposition before Him. We're to be submitters to Allah. According to Islamic theology, it's this sense that this idea that we've gone astray that requires the Muslim community that has been woken up, that has become enlightened in some sense. It becomes incumbent upon them to struggle or pursue us to get us to come back on track, to get us to come back on what the Quran calls the Sirata Mustaqim, the straight path, which is something that's laid out in the Quran, but we could know it by our nature according to Islam. So you could say there's a strong natural theology in Islam that says Islam is the religion of nature, and it's the religion of everybody in here, they claim. It's just that your parents baptized you or did something else to kind of screw you up. Moving on to prophets and books. We've talked a bit about this. So there's a strong notion in Islam, the Quran, you find it all over the place, where Muhammad talks about the gospel, the Torah, the Psalms as if they're legitimate, divinely revealed books. The problem is they've been corrupted. They were originally, in a sense, Islamic books, but the texts themselves, or at least the interpretation of these texts, have been corrupted. So they're not all that useful unless you interpret these texts through the lens of the Quran, which according to the Quran itself and according to the Muslim world, is the most perfect book. It's God's eternal speech. So if it is God's eternal speech, it is a good lens through which you should look at the world and everything within it. Unfortunately, it's not. It's a false, contrived book. In the books, or in the Quran, you get this long train of the prophets that we talked about, this long sense of there being prophets ever since the time of Adam up until the time of Muhammad. I want to focus in on one of these prophets just to highlight just how different Islam is from Christianity. And that is the prophet Isa, or Jesus, in the Quran. Jesus is mentioned over a dozen times in the Quran. Chapter 19 has a pretty long, extended discussion about his birth and his early ministry. Talks about Mary, a Virgin Mary, giving birth to a boy named Jesus. When Jesus comes out of the birth canal, it's not that explicit in the Quran, but that's the way Muslims understand it. He looks up at Mary, who's a bit distraught. She's outside of Jerusalem underneath a palm tree, wondering how she's going to tell her kinsman when she goes back to her hometown how she got this baby, though because she's not married. And Jesus looks up to Mary and says, "Don't worry." Chapter 19, verse 33 of the Quran, "Blessed am I on this day, I am a prophet of Allah. Blessed am I on the day I will die, and the day I will rise again from the dead." You get in chapter 19 and other places in the Quran, you get all these stories from non-canonical gospel traditions of Jesus breathing life into like clay pigeons, not the kind you shoot, but a little trinket, a knick-knack that... I won't say anything about my wife and her knickknacks because it's on tape. But a little he breathes into it, and all of a sudden the pigeon becomes alive and flies away. He does other miraculous things, heals the sick, raises the dead. And then when it comes to the end of Jesus' life, actually not the end of his life, but the end of his ministry, in the Quran in chapter 4, verse 157 and 158, a really interesting thing happens. You have Jesus who's conceived of as a prophet to the nation of Israel. A prophet of Allah or a prophet of Islam to the nation of Israel is the picture is, according to Islamic theology, on the night when he was betrayed, because he's a prophet of Allah, and Allah would not allow his prophets to undergo shame. Jesus looks around the room, knowing that he's going to be arrested. And the Quranic commentaries say that he asked his disciples who will take his place on the cross. And there are a couple different traditions. The more popular one says that Judas raised his hand. And as soon as Judas did that, his face was transformed, a divine facelift of some sort, so that he looked like Jesus. The roof of the room they were in opened up, and Jesus was pulled into heaven, escaping death. Quran 4, 157 and 158 says, the Jews did not kill, nor did they crucify Jesus. Instead, he was taken up into heaven. He's up in heaven, according to Islam, awaiting the last day, or the final judgment, where he will come back down. And when all the dead are raised in Islam, according to Islam, The Christians will be on one side, LCMS folk way on the other, the far end of that group of people. And Allah is going to say to Jesus, pointing to the Christians, according to Quran 5:118 and 119, did you teach these people, these Christians, to worship you, that is Jesus, as God? And Jesus says to Allah, I would have never told them something like that you didn't give me or didn't instruct me to teach them. So what you get in the Quran is a disowning of Christianity by the Muslim prophet Jesus. So you will get out there. I remember going to New York City when I taught at Concordia, Bronxville. We'd go down we had to do field trips. They forced us to do field trips for college students. And so I'd take them down to the mosque just to see it. And there was always this marquee, this scrolling marquee outside of it that says, we believe in Adam, Moses, and all the other prophets, Jesus and Muhammad, as if to suggest that Muslims and Christians believe the same thing about Jesus. The Jesus of Islam is the Jesus of Islam. It's not the historical slash biblical, the same thing, Jesus. It's an invented view of Jesus that seems to have been cobbled together from traditions from the Arabian Peninsula in the 6th and 7th centuries. You find some of the teachings in the Quran about Jesus. They're certainly not in the Gospels, but they're found in things like the Arabic infancy gospel, these spurious forgeries that were developed in the 3rd and 4th century and subsequent centuries in the period of late antiquity. What about Muhammad? Muhammad, according to a Muslim, they will tell you is the equal of Jesus and every other prophet. Muhammad is not a special person in Islam in the sense that he's divine. He's just a prophet. At the same time, the way Muslims speak about Muhammad is that they will say he's the most perfect man. That is, if there's somebody to emulate ethically, and just in terms of your behavior, it would be Muhammad. He's the most perfect, quintessential, archetypal man. There's one tradition, and if you're easily offended, close your ears, I guess. I'm going to tell you it anyway. That says that Muhammad was so perfect in his virility that he would pass amongst 40 different women in one night. I remember reading this, thinking, and I did the math, and I said, no way, impossible. And I asked my supervisor, I said, what's up with this? Because you guys regard this as a sound or legitimate tradition about Muhammad. And he says, yes, it sounds a bit far-fetched, but what you don't understand is that he was not supernatural. He didn't have any special powers or anything like that, but he was what every man should be. Virile, aggressive, but at the same time, passionate, perhaps even compassionate, a Muslim might add. So in understanding how Muslims behave, at least traditional-minded conservative Muslims, you have to understand that for them, Muhammad is the exemplar. All the more reason to read Robert Spencer's book, The Truth About Muhammad. I mentioned that, I think, three or 4 weeks ago when we first met. That text will disclose from Muslim sources just what Muslim traditions teach about Muhammad, apart from all the stuff the liberal writers like to put in there, like how he liked to take care of orphans and widows and things like that. He did do that according to the traditions, but on top of that, he also beheaded Jews, engaged in adulterous affairs and other things. Married a 6-year-old. It's not so bad, they say, because they didn't consummate till she was 9, as if that makes it better, and things like that. But as far as the nature of Muhammad, Muhammad is seen as another prophet, just like any other prophet in the Islamic tradition. He's not any more special than Jesus, Moses, Adam, Noah, Abraham, or anybody in between. One of the things, if you read through the Quran, that looms large in the Quran, I would be willing to suggest that maybe about at least a 1/6 or a 1/5 of the Quran is filled with eschatological or apocalyptic language. There's a real strong sense, and it's part of the Muslim confession of faith, that history is linear. It started at a certain point in a time when God created from nothing, and history will move along to a certain end. There will be a last day, according to Islam. On that day, all the dead will be raised up and will be judged in accordance with their deeds. As a Muslim sees it, every one of us, in our Muslim and non-Muslim, there are no Muslims here, but if we had some Muslims here, we'd include them as well. Every single person throughout the course of their life has at least an angel, some say 2 angels, watching over you, recording everything you do. Your good deeds go in one scroll, your bad deeds go in another scroll. And when the last day comes, the picture in the Quran is these scrolls will be opened up for all to see. And depending on how the weight of your deeds, where they come out in the scale, that determines where you're going to go ultimately. Whether it be to eternal paradise, where if you're a man, you'll enjoy 70 or 72 virgins, black-eyed virgins who only have eyes for you. And women, according to the tradition, have men serving them, men from Africa, perpetually. If you're found to be wanting, you've done too many bad deeds that outweigh your good deeds, and you're not a Muslim, you'll spend the eternity in hellfire, where your body and your beliefs will be fuel for the fires of hell, as the Quran puts it. That's the picture you get in the Quran. There are some passages in the Quran, though, actually quite a few of them, and this is part of Islamic theology. Muslims themselves debate over this. Some say that eternal punishment might be temporary. And so you will get Muslims out there that say, no, everybody eventually will be in paradise forever. But the traditional line, or the traditional belief, is that all non-Muslims, and in fact perhaps some Muslims, will be in hell forever. Ultimately, according to Islamic theology, you cannot know where your fate is because of the strong belief that your fate has been sealed by Allah even before He created you. You think Calvinism's strong on predestination? Islam's even a little bit stronger than 110 proof Calvinism. Very strong belief in predestination, and this has caused a lot of debate in the Islamic tradition. Some say, well, if God has predestined you to do these things and end up here, what's the point of doing good deeds? Why not just do whatever you want, because you're going to go wherever Allah has predetermined anyway. So you do find a bit of tension in the Islamic tradition over whether you can know whether you'll be saved or not on the basis of your deeds. The traditional line is that you simply can't. It's this, for the Christian, this sense of uncertainty that opens up all sorts of opportunities for speaking with Muslims. It may seem intimidating to speak to Muslims. I dare say, though, you'll find your average Muslim is pretty easy to talk to. Most of them are very hospitable. Not all of them. You can get some grouchy ones. I usually run into them. But they're fairly hospitable, and as you nurture friendships with them, you'll find that they actually like serious conversations. I'd avoid political things like Israel. That's a hot-button issue. But you will find that they do have some of them at least, have some respect for conservative Christians who maintain conservative, classic Christian identities. And they're oftentimes shocked to find that there are Christians who still hold to classic Christian doctrines. I've found it over time and time again, where most Muslims, the Christians they encounter are those who are part of interfaith dialogue, who typically tend to be liberal types. And so you'll find that they have a bit of respect. They'll have a bit of respect, perhaps, of you if you're conservative in your religious views. And you'll find that they oftentimes, over the course of a friendship, will be open to conversations. There are two things, if I can offer, two practical suggestions that the Christian should focus on in speaking with Muslims. One is this idea, or this drawing upon the sense of, if they have it, this sense of what Luther would call Anfechtung, they must have when they really think about their fate. They can't know. You can know if you're going to go to heaven if you die in jihad. Most Muslims, at least here in America, thank God, aren't going to strap bombs to their bodies and blow themselves up. There might be a few, I don't know. But most of them, if you push them on it, whether they've done enough good to know that that those good deeds will outweigh their bad, they don't know, and they can't know. So drawing on that, what we might call existential side of Islam, which does lead to, or at least should lead to, an existential crisis, is of the essence for speaking to a Muslim as a Christian, motivated by the gospel. Another point, though, is the apologetic point. The Muslim denial, the Quranic denial that Jesus was crucified on a cross, is an excellent entry point into conversing with a Muslim on neutral territory. The crucifixion of Jesus has, of course, cosmic theological ramifications. On that cross and in the resurrection 3 days later, the sins of the entire world were paid for. But the crucifixion itself is a historical event. I've used it several times. I'm not looking to win the debate necessarily, but I'm looking to crack open doors to the Muslim worldview. I've approached Muslims by asking them the question about the crucifixion. How is it that Muslims can deny something that is what I would call a brute fact of history, that Jesus was crucified on a cross? Their Quran says he wasn't crucified on the cross. We have not only eyewitness documents, companions of eyewitnesses, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We have other first century sources, Josephus, the Jewish historian, hostile sources, Tacitus, Suetonius, and other Roman writers, who all take as a matter of fact that Jesus was crucified on a cross. And the question I oftentimes ask a Muslim is, why would you take a text that purports to speak about a historical event 600 plus years after the actual event as more authoritative than a whole bunch of eyewitnesses and companions of eyewitnesses and historians from the first century? That's just a basic historical debate. It doesn't get into all the details of theology and the emotions that are involved with theology. It's a historical question. So please don't be scared of Muslims, even though perhaps I've made you scared of them. And in approaching them, focus on the central issues rather than philosophical debates about God, perhaps the politically contagious or politically exciting topics of jihad and Israel and things like that. Probably best to avoid when approaching Islam as a Christian. There's certainly room to approach Islam as a Christian, but acting as a citizen of the United States to deal with those left-hand kingdom civil issues that should concern us all. But in personal relationships with Muslims, as a Christian speaking the gospel to a Muslim, there are all sorts of opportunities that we enjoy here in America with the Muslim community, especially as much of the Muslim community isn't so aggressive, at least not at present. There certainly are some, though. We're at 11:30. I can stick around for 10 minutes max, and then I got to get on the road. Yes, sir.
About the fact that you said in America that there's a lot of politicized sort of middle of the road Muslims, but you said that for a Muslim to be guaranteed heaven, jihad or death through jihad. So what's to say that we're not going to see more of that in America as
Nothing.
They wish to be agreed? Yeah.
Nothing. That's the big socio-cultural or socio-political or the terrorism concern is homegrown terrorism. You've got the sources, you've got all the ideas, and so you could easily, somebody could go to them with a particular imam who wants to push this type of political ideology and interpret it this way and go about it. We've seen it happen with the Fort Hood shootings with Hassan, Abdul Malik Hassan, I believe was his name, and others as well. So there's nothing to keep it from happening, except some argue if we could encourage and even patronize a very liberal form of Islam, throw money their way, raise their spokespeople to superstar status, even though they go against the Quran and they're denounced by the Muslim world. Or another way, and the way Mark Stein once argued in National Review, in a great little article, one-page article called Apostasy and Moderation. He says, Muslims aren't going to embrace hardcore secularism, which a lot of people want them to embrace. That's apostasy to them. And they're smart, they have enough common sense to realize that life, the universe, doesn't make sense if there is no creator. So they need a theology. And he says the answer to the problem with radical Islam is that the only solution for Islam, ultimately, is in evangelizing Christianity. And he goes on, he says, but this is probably the worst answer of all because Christianity doesn't evangelize anymore. It's lost its conviction that it's true and that it can square off and meet the challenges of Islam. That's several months back in National Review. If you want, it's a great little piece on dealing with radical Islam in the face or in view of all these claims that we can just moderate or reform Islam. That's a temporary solution, to be sure, or perhaps, but it's not a long-term solution, especially for a Christian interested in speaking the gospel to a Muslim. One more question. Okay. You're on, sir.
On 9/11, I was puzzled by the actions of the people who knocked down our buildings in New York. So I bought a copy of the Quran, and I'd read it a couple times. And I read it in the same spirit I would read the Bible. In other words, this is what they believe, this is what I believe. And as I read along, the Quran essentially demolishes Christ, exactly what we believe. And as a matter of fact, the opening prayer is, praise be to Allah, the Lord of the worlds, the Master of the world, of whatever you call it. Okay. And I kept reading, and finally got down to chapter 5, verse 51. And it says, oh, you believe, do not be friends with the Jews and the Christians. They're friends of one another. Mm-hmm. And if you are friends with them, you're one of them, and Allah does not guide the Jews and the Christians. So, and then I read a little bit further and finally got further down into it. And the bottom line seemed to be, if you can't convert the world, kill them. So would you like to comment on 551, do not be friends with the Jews and the Christians? That's a tough one.
It's been, there's an earlier, or it's later in the Quran, but earlier in Muhammad's life, 2946, where Muhammad tells Muslims, when you come across people of the book, Christians and Jews, deal with them kindly. Don't deal with them harshly, and tell them that our God and your God is one. Your scriptures and our scriptures are one. That is, they say the same thing. But then you get chapter 5, verse 51, or chapter 9, verse 29. Kill the people of the book. That's all been, abrogated. Or the earlier stuff, 2946, has been declared illegitimate, according to the other passages. Another passage, Quran 98, verse 6, the people of the book and the all-mushrikun, the polytheists, that is all non-Muslims. Even if you're a monotheist, even if you're part of the Abrahamic faith, a Jew or a Christian, are the lowest or the most detestable of all creatures. That's a later, a Medinan chapter in the Quran, even though it's way at the tail end of the Quran. And that's how historically, it's not every Muslim, but historically Islam as an institution has viewed Christianity and Judaism. These are corrupted religions. The Jews and Christians work together. They're friends to themselves. They're not friends with Muslims. So don't think, even if a Christian opens up his hand of friendship to you, don't think that you can trust him. That's just part of the Quranic view of things. Not every Muslim, of course, but the Quranic view of things. And so therefore, because it's the Quranic view of things, it's the way Muslims should view things. But thankfully, they don't always follow the Quran the way they should. That's it. Sorry, you're the most detestable of all creatures. This mean for us. Today, I want to look at that question a little more closely. In particular, I want to cover the issue of Islam in America. Please understand, I've made this distinction before. You'll probably be tired of me making this distinction, but I think it's important to keep at the front of our minds that while I'm talking about Islam and its influence or its intrusion into lots of secular aspects of our life, we do need to keep this distinction between Islam and Muslims. Muslims should buy into the classic theology of Islam. Thankfully, not every Muslim does. Otherwise, we'd have an even greater problem on our hand. But at the same time, we need to keep, while we need to make this distinction, we need to, I would say, as I've put it before, take a very hard line against Islam and keep it at bay. In fact, stay very active in ensuring that its law, its political ideology is removed from the public realm. That does not mean Christians are absolved of the responsibility, and I would say even more privilege, of engaging Muslims and speaking the gospel to them. It's a very tight line we have to walk here. But let's start. I'm going to start our talk on Islam in America actually in Egypt in the late 1920s. I think there are lots of ways to talk about Islam in America and how it's grown and why it's making so many inroads into our public life. I think the best way to understand, though, what's behind all of that, and I don't want to use the term conspiracy. Like I told you, I'm no conspiracy theorist, though people have accused me of it. There is a pattern or a plan behind things. And before I get moving, let me make one suggestion. I gave you a handout several weeks when we did the first 3 sessions, and it had some bibliography in it. I believe it had a reference to a movie that I think is absolutely vital for viewing to understand why things are, what's behind everything. It's called The Third Jihad. I think the full length is 2 hours. You can get a free sample of it, a 30-minute sample of it on Google Videos. For those of you who are familiar with the internet, I assume most of us are here. I'm not so familiar. Dr. Van Voorst will tell you. But 30 minutes, and it's done by, the great thing about this video is it's done by a very, we might say, liberal, secular-minded or moderate-minded Muslim. So it's not some right-wing crank out there like myself trying to expose some sort of hidden conspiracy. It's a Muslim saying, to understand why things are going on the way they are, we have to understand this. And a lot of what I'm going to cover will dovetail what's covered in that video. So let's go back to Egypt. Around 1928, a man named Hassan al-Banna and like-minded individuals looked around the Muslim world in the 20th century and came to the conclusion, like lots of Muslims have since, that Islamic civilization was in a state of decline and, in fact, defeat. For the Muslim mind, the 17th century, September 11th, 1683, when Muslims were finally turned back at Vienna, that marks, if there is a particular day in their history they will identify as the beginning of decline, that would be it. In the late 17th century, up until the middle of the 20th century, perhaps even presently, in their mind, the Western world has dominated Islam, has influenced its political, legal, and economic institutions, and is also right now influencing the theology or the ideology of Islam. I believe I mentioned some time ago, I'll drop the name again, a man named Abdulaziz Sakhaddina wrote a book just a couple years back entitled The Islamic Roots of Democratic Pluralism. And he's a Western Muslim scholar teaching out of University of Virginia. He argues that the traditional ideology of Islam was a product of centuries of development, and it was largely, according to him, arbitrary. He says Muslims in the West can just deconstruct historical Islam, that is, completely alter Islam, and in its place reconstruct a new version of Islam that is kinder and gentler and everything else, in order to make Islam relevant for life in the West. Abdulaziz is a very liberal-minded Muslim, originally from Africa, a very intelligent man. His message has reached large audiences here in America. When he's in the Muslim world, he's not well received. In fact, a prohibition on his teachings was issued some years back, I believe around 1999, that says you cannot teach this kinder, gentler form of Islam, and that's not the exact verbiage, in the Muslim world because it's not Islam. But go ahead and teach it in the West. When Muslims look at Abdulaziz and other liberal-minded Muslims in America, like Zuhdi Jasser, the man who does is the commentator on the third jihad. They see a Muslim that is being shaped by Western ideas, perhaps even some Christian ideas or Judeo-Christian ideas. So as Hassan al-Banna in Egypt around in the 1920s looked at the Muslim world, it was in a state of defeat and it was dominated by the West. He gives birth to an organization known as the Muslim Brotherhood. You've probably at least heard of them on the news as the events back in February in Egypt started taking off. But the Muslim Brotherhood did not remain an Egyptian organization. It quickly fanned out across the Muslim world and now is located in almost every Western country. All throughout Europe, even America has a presence of the Muslim Brotherhood of various forms and entities. The Muslim Brotherhood had as its goal, to restore or resurrect Islamic civilization, to defend and promote the integrity of Islam initially within the Muslim world. The way they started doing this was through education, some social services, feeding the poor, providing clothing and shelter to especially Muslims along the Nile River in Egypt. But shortly after this initial sort of local, this attempt to improve the local issues, the Muslim Brotherhood became much more global in its outlook. A couple decades later, as the Muslim Brotherhood is developing, is expanding, a man named Sayyid Qutb, spelled Q-U-T-B, didn't take charge of the Muslim Brotherhood, but was quickly recognized as the leading thinker of the Muslim Brotherhood. He lives through most of the 20th century until 1966, where he's executed by the Egyptian government for his Islamism. His claim that, this was Sayyid Qutb's particular claim, that the entire world, including the Muslim world, because it's been so dominated by the West, and in his day and age, primarily the French and the British, but very shortly thereafter, America, the Muslim world had been corrupted. And the whole Muslim world is in a state, as well as the rest of the world, a state of jahiliyyah, or ignorance. It has turned its back in varying degrees against the light of Islam. And so Sayyid Qutb began formulating what we might call an ideological response to this. You can read a number of works by Sayyid Qutb. He starts writing after he gets back from America. He was here from 1948 to about 1951 on a Egyptian-American funded fellowship to come to America to Greenlee Teachers College in Colorado to learn about American education. When he came to America, he was a relatively secular-minded Egyptian Muslim. He gets here, and from a writing he wrote shortly after he returns to Egypt, called The America I've Seen, he becomes radicalized, we might say. That's the terminology we would use. He would say he became a proper Muslim. And he argued that America is absolutely morally, politically, economically, and religiously corrupt. And as he looks around his native Egypt, he sees that, and as well as surrounding countries, that more and more Muslim countries are coming under the influence of different degrees of America and its foreign policy. So he writes a work eventually called Milestones, which is probably one of his most important books. If you want to get into Sayyid Qutb's head real quickly, in about 80 pages, you can read this book. And he puts forward this thesis that the whole world is in a state of ignorance. Muslims have as their God-given duty the responsibility to restore an outpost of integral Islam, not in the Middle East necessarily, but wherever they can. If it's in America, if it's in Europe, if it's in Afghanistan, the Sudan, wherever Muslims strive hard, and the Arabic term for strive is jihad, engage in jihad, they should begin trying to restore the integrity of Islam. In particular, to restore the lost Darul Islam. We talked about this a long time ago, maybe over a month ago now, that in the classic Muslim view of things, there is the Darul Islam, that is the house or abode or realm of Islam, where the majority of the people are Muslim, the politics, the economics, the law, the mores, and everything else are Islamic, and that domain has as its task, as its collective duty, that is, everybody's responsible for it, expanding and bringing the, as they would put it, the light of Islam to the domain of war or the domain of the struggle. That is territory outside of the domain of Islam. This sort of worldview is what got Qutb in trouble. It's classically Islamic, but please understand in the 20th century, including today, most of these countries in the Middle East or the Muslim world, real austere Muslims don't view these countries as Islamic. They limit the Sharia, that is Islamic law, to domestic issues, marriage, inheritance laws, divorce, things like that. When it comes to your public laws, this is a fusion of Sharia and Western ideas. And so when Sayyid Qutb begins saying that Muslims need to return to the integrity of Islam and eventually implement Sharia all across the board in terms of the legal infrastructure and replace the existing governments with Islamic governments, he's seen as a subversive in Egypt, as has the Muslim Brotherhood has been seen as a subversive entity throughout most of the history of Egypt and the Muslim world. So he's executed in 1966. His ideas, however, don't die with him. While he was in prison, he wrote a commentary on the Quran, which is currently being translated into English. I believe they're at volume 20, and they're not even 3/4 of the way through the Quran. It's a massive text. If you were to go into an Islamic bookstore, anywhere in English-speaking lands, I would be willing to bet that if they have a Quran in stock, or a commentary on the Quran in stock, it would be Sayyid Qutb's commentary. His ideas are extremely influential. Also influential, or his influence will also reach, or perhaps we might say inform, and motivate his brother, a man named Muhammad Qutb, who was able to get out of Egypt as the suppression of the Muslim Brotherhood increased, and eventually wound up in Saudi Arabia. Taught in various universities, most notably the University of Mecca, where he was a tutor to a young Osama bin Laden. And we don't know that Osama bin Laden read Sayyid Qutb. There's not a whole lot of evidence. He certainly knew who he was, but he certainly was influenced by Muhammad Qutb, who was his tutor, and so therefore the ideas of Sayyid Qutb make their way into the mind of Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden will begin to alter the ideas a bit to justify a global jihad. Rather than focusing on establishing as your first order of business a domain of Islam, just simply engaging in total warfare, total terroristic type of warfare. As we get to, Sayyid Qutb's put to death in 1966. His brother Muhammad moves to Saudi Arabia, and we don't know exactly when. His biography is notoriously complicated, and there's not a whole lot of evidence from which we could actually draw up a proper biography. He'd have to write one for himself, and he's not going to. He's been in hiding for quite some time. But probably in the 1970s or 80s, he makes his way to Saudi Arabia. Moving from the Middle East to America, in the 1980s, you have members of the Muslim Brotherhood begin to emigrate to America under the umbrella of persecution. In order to gain a green card and eventually citizenship, they argue to the immigration board that they are persecuted for their beliefs in the Muslim world, and so we welcome, especially after 1965, welcome them with open arms, not really paying attention to why they're persecuted over in Egypt and other places. One man in particular, though there are a whole bunch of them, Muhammad Akram, wrote a report in 1991 about a meeting that had taken place throughout the 1980s under the heading of the Shura Council, a meeting comprised of American Muslims, most notoriously in 1987, where they talked about and started strategizing and detailing the aims or the goals of the Brotherhood in America. The document he wrote was from 1991. It summarizes the Muslim Brotherhood in America's worldview, or View for America. You can get this document online. It's entitled An Explanatory Memorandum of the Strategic Goals for the Group. It'll be the first thing that pops up if you type this into Google. And it gives you a window into exactly how at least a particular group of Muslims view their role in America. The document wasn't for public consumption for a long time until 2007, when an organization known as the Holy Land Foundation was brought on trial, eventually, just recently in fact, found guilty for funneling funds, millions of dollars, under the title of Islamic charities to Hamas, so it could buy rockets and lob them into Israel. And but we learned of it around 2007, and if you read it, it is very eye-opening. These folks who are involved in this meeting, these meetings throughout the 1980s, make it very clear they see their role in America as a process of Islamic settlement within America. And they talk about how eventually it is the goal of the Muslim Brotherhood to sabotage and destroy not just America, but Western civilization from within. They know, as do most Islamist organizations, that they simply cannot compete with the American military machine. And so they begin suggesting that perhaps our jihad, as they put it, our struggle, will take a different means. And the term they use is a cultural jihad. To begin implanting, or not implanting, that sounds too conspiratorial, but begin encouraging Muslims to become more active in America, to begin establishing organizations in America so that it can begin the process of the civilizational jihadist process. The short-term goal is to make Islam an alternative religion or an alternative ideology in America. As a long-term goal, it's to get Muslims involved in politics, economics, and everything else in America so that slowly, very slowly, with a long-determined end in mind, change the socio-cultural and political landscape in America. This, I know, sounds conspiratorial. It's in the document. Read it for yourself. Now, how influential is the Muslim Brotherhood? Are they all that significant of a challenge, or I think probably threat is more accurate? If you look around America, look at all the Muslim organizations, you're not going to find, that I know of, anyone saying that they're Al-Ikhwan, the Brotherhood. This explanatory memorandum lists, however, and this was the thing that really shocked people, 29 organizations that are either friendly organizations or organizations that were started by the Muslim Brotherhood to sort of disassociate themselves just by their very title. The organizations have names like Council on, well actually that organization is not named in the explanatory memorandum because it had a different name at that time, but Council on American Islamic Relations, Muslim Student Associations, there are 400 of these in North America, Islamic Circle of North America, and everything else. We're all identified at least as organizations that have the same goals in mind of the Muslim Brotherhood, if not being founded by the Muslim Brotherhood. Most of these organizations are still around today. They're very active, and I think in the subsequent decades we're going to see them become even more active because they've been very successful in accomplishing what they've wanted to accomplish. If you look at the numbers of Muslims in America, it's hard to determine just how many there are, but probably a conservative estimate is about 7 million. If you want to judge, though, the activity of Islam or Muslims in America, I think the best way to look at it is look at the mosques we have around America, how quickly they've grown in number and what they're involved in. Back in the 1980s, there were less than 100 mosques in America. 1994, there were about 965, I think is the number. Just a little more than a decade after that study was done. Now, around 2009, somebody determined, I think